Today we're diving deep into the shadows of power, diplomacy, and the enigmatic figure who navigated the complexities of global politics like a grand master on the chessboard of history. A man whose name is synonymous with both brilliance and controversy, Henry Kissinger. We are joined by Thomas Schwartz, professor of history and foreign relations at Vanderbilt University and author of Henry Kissinger and American Power, which will be linked in the description below. Enjoy the episode. So Thomas, welcome to American History Gazette.
Oh, well, thank you very much for having me on the program.
Henry Kissinger, the subject of today's discussion, is such a fascinating character in American history. Coming from humble beginnings as a Jew in Nazi Germany, he rose to the peak of American politics and power, which is just remarkable. So briefly, who was Henry Kissinger?
Okay, Henry Kissinger was one of those prominent and important American diplomats of the 20th century. He was Secretary of State and National Security Advisor during a crucial period in American history in the late 1960s and 1970s. He was involved in important transformations in America's diplomatic presence. And then even after he left office, he remained an influential figure in shaping American foreign policy for the next half century. In that sense, he was very much a dominant figure in the American-led world system of the time.
Yeah, he was no doubt, like you said, a very influential figure in politics and foreign policy throughout the 20th century. But like I mentioned earlier, he's a Jew and he's born in Nazi Germany, which is, as we know, a not very good time to be a Jew and not a very good place. So where exactly was he born and what was it like for him to grow up as a Jew in Nazi Germany?
Well, Kissinger was born he was born in Fürth, which is a small town near Nuremberg in Bavaria in Germany, southern Germany. He was born in 1923. He was 9 years old when the Nazis came to power in 1933. He and his brother, he had a younger brother who was only about a year and a half younger than he was. His father immediately lost his job and position. He and his brother were not able to attend the regular German schools. They had to attend a special Jewish school. The mother really took over at this period, and she was the one who really decided to get the family out of Germany. And over the next years, she planned basically their emigration from Germany. And they were able to leave before the worst of the worst happened, although Kissinger remembered the ostracism, the occasionally being beaten up by German boys and all the rest. But the family was able to leave before the worst.
They were definitely one of the very fortunate few who were able to get out before, the really brutal business began. And we all know how that played out, awful. But he would rise to, a very prominent figure in politics and obviously have his views on foreign policy. But did escaping Nazi Germany and growing up in Nazi Germany shape his political views and his world views as he got older?
This is one of those interesting things that certainly did. I think everyone who studies Kissinger believes that this had an impact on him. For a time, he was somewhat dismissive of that. He didn't want people to think that he was shaped by the persecution and experiences of his youth. But I think to a certain extent, certain aspects of his thinking about international politics, particularly his concern with creating conditions of stability and order, and his fear of disorder and revolution, also his distrust of mass democracy. After all, Hitler was elected by the Germans. The dictatorship came through democratic means. And this was something Kissinger never had quite the aspiring idea of bringing democracy to the world that many American diplomats have talked about, because he didn't always trust democracy. He didn't trust the people. In that sense, he often, I think, was affected by what he had seen, how the most modern country in Europe, the most technologically advanced in Europe, um, and one of the most, I mean, really quite the leading nation, descended into barbarity. And I mean, I think he recognized that created in his mind the sense that tragedy, that awful things can happen if the right conditions can take place. So I think in that sense, it scarred him in very fundamental ways in the way in which he went about his diplomacy and his thinking.
Yeah, I think that's a very important thing to think about when thinking about democracy is great, but it can also mean mob rule. Mob rule is also a form of democracy, and like we saw, it can lead to those authoritarian governments, which is not good. So I think that's very important to think about when thinking about democracy is you have to set the framework and you have to set checks and balances in a democracy for it to be functional. But he emigrates to the United States. He excels academically, and as World War II breaks out, he gets drafted into the army like so many others. So what happens to him when he gets drafted into the army to go fight in World War II?
Well, what I think happens is interesting because Kissinger emigrates to New York City, but he remains fairly isolated within what was the German Jewish area of New York, Fort Washington. He and his family join a synagogue there. They are with other German Jews. The area was there were so many German Jews there that people called it the Fourth Reich, which was a rather ironic way of looking at it. But getting drafted into the U.S. Army was a sort of forced assimilation for Henry Kissinger. It really brought him into contact with all sorts of Americans, but it also led him to, for the first time, to be singled out in really quite important ways. He tested high in an IQ program. For a time, he was in a specialized Army program that was designed for particularly intellectually gifted troops. That program ended up having to be canceled because of manpower needs. But then Kissinger ended up being recruited for counterintelligence in the Army. And in that sense, his experience in the Army both made him into more of an American, or at least more assimilated, but it also allowed him to excel. And ultimately, of course, when he was going over to Germany as now an American soldier, it would lead him into a situation where he was returning to the land that had expelled him, and he returned as a conqueror, part of the American Army of Occupation, which I think also was a very important psychological change for Henry Kissinger.
Yeah, it's one of the more interesting parts of Kissinger's story is this part of his story, and there's 3 points to make here. I know he was very proud of his time in the Army because he said it made him feel like an American. And that's very important, and it would be very important later on as he rose in American politics. And also, it's here where he really started to excel and like you said, be singled out and put in these administrative roles where he could use his intelligence to make important decisions. And the third point is he was going back to Nazi Germany where he had escaped from as a Jew, and that is something I would like to flesh out next is, what was it like for him psychologically and physically to go back to Nazi Germany where he escaped as a Jew and then to come back and see all the atrocities committed by the Nazis? I know he was involved in liberating concentration camps, but when he left, Jews were being persecuted, but he didn't know it would get to that extent. So what was that shock like for him when he finally saw it?
I think it was quite profound. I think it actually, I think ironically, it for a time it broke him from his Orthodox Judaism. I mean, I think he began to abandon the religion of his parents. You see that in some of his letters. He recognized the evil that people can commit. He was certainly the experience of going into the concentration camp or one of the camps at Alam, and actually encountering people who had been starved and who died when the troops tried to feed them solid food and who were incapable of that. I mean, I think it had a shocking impact on him. The interesting thing, and this is what a lot of people who are very critical of Kissinger really rarely give him credit for this, he did not develop an intense hatred of the Germans, which many others did. He, in fact, recognized that there was both the conditions of dictatorship, but also that there were differences in the way many Germans behaved. And he did not, even though his father said, in letters to him, you've got to be tough on the Germans, Kissinger would write back, look, we have to figure out a way to make this country work again and be part of the civilized world. And he was, as a leader in the occupation, he was actually quite generous in many respects in how he behaved toward Germans. And his own sense was the need to figure out a way to reconcile a new Germany with the Western world and with the United States. And in that sense, it really is an interesting commentary on his thinking, that in a way he exercised authority, but he exercised it with, I think, some understanding of the people he was now ruling over.
Obviously, it would be very easy for Kissinger as a Jew to develop that hatred that so many did, but it was very, like you said, understanding of him to recognize that that wouldn't necessarily be helpful in the situation, that he took on more of a progressive view that we need to, immediately start thinking of rebuilding and reconstruction and getting this country back on his feet. And he would stay there for a few years after the war as part of that post-war government. But he eventually goes back to the United States, and FDR signs the GI Bill, which allows all of the servicemen and women of World War II to attend college. And he gets accepted into Harvard, which is pretty incredible. So how did he get accepted into Harvard, and what did he choose to study?
Well, Kissinger, Harvard was actually quite welcoming to American GIs, and Kissinger had done so well on the various Army tests. He had strong letters from some of the men who had served with him in counterintelligence that I think this, along with, he had 1 year of college in New York City that he had done well in. So I think this was something of Harvard's opening to, you might say, to GIs after the war. Harvard was led at that time by a very progressive and understanding figure, James Conant, who was actually very involved also in the Manhattan Project that produced the atomic bomb. But Conant was a scientist, but he also recognized the need to make Harvard more inclusive, particularly of a broader spectrum of the American population than the elites that Harvard previously had catered to. And in that sense, Kissinger's application was not unusual in that Harvard was open more to American servicemen and women after the war than it was beforehand.
That's good. So what did he choose to study when he was at Harvard?
Interestingly enough, he ended up choosing government. Now, when he told the story, he talked about taking chemistry and thinking that he might want to do chemistry or something like that, but he actually fell in with particularly with a mentor, a tutor, William Yandell Elliott, who took an immediate interest in Kissinger. Elliott is an interesting figure, a Vanderbilt University graduate who also was a Rhodes Scholar and was a talent scout of some sort. I mean, Elliott had played a role in the War Production Administration during the war. He was always looking for talented students, and he saw in Kissinger an extraordinary figure, and he mentored him. He had him in a number of classes, and Kissinger ultimately would write his thesis under Elliott's supervision. And in this sense, Kissinger would basically be advanced by many of the mentors that he acquired over the years.
Henry Kissinger would ultimately become known for being a foreign policy advisor and foreign policy diplomat. So how did he go from studying government, and what led him to focus his studies on foreign policy?
Well, government at Harvard really was political science, and you could specialize in different features of it. And Kissinger specialized almost immediately in international relations, although his thesis is actually far more on philosophy. His undergraduate thesis was much more philosophically based, but it still dealt with theorists of, you might say, of the larger issues of history. But Kissinger was very interested in the nature of international order. I think one of the things that influenced him was the idea of wanting to figure out what history could teach about how to create conditions for peace and international order and stability. In that sense, he was a little different from many of his fellow students, all of whom thought that the atomic bomb and the new technological developments had made history irrelevant. Kissinger, even though he wasn't a traditional historian in the way we might think of it academically today, really valued history. He saw history, as he once said, was the memory of states. And so he was very interested in understanding how, in history, particularly how diplomats had in the past created the conditions for a peaceful international order. And that would become, of course, the subject of his doctoral dissertation.
I'd like to get into his dissertation next because it's really here where he starts to get recognized as, a prominent figure in foreign policy, and his views are really valued. He starts getting appointed to various boards and being brought on as an advisor to various people and organizations. So what did he write his dissertation on, and why was he starting to get so recognized?
Well, the interesting thing is the dissertation, while I think it played a very fundamental role in his intellectual development, was not really the key to his recognition. His recognition really came while he was a grad student with the fact that his mentor set up two programs that he had Kissinger running. Kissinger was a very, very busy grad student. He ran one program, which was an international seminar that invited young people, particularly ambitious and intellectually gifted figures also in the professions from Europe and then from other countries, younger people, to the United States to have a seminar in the summer where they would learn something about the United States. And in this way, Kissinger developed a network of international contacts among many younger leaders who would later go on to lead their countries, who would know Henry Kissinger because he directed the Cambridge seminar during the summer. The other was a journal that Kissinger edited that solicited articles from major figures, political, intellectual, other leaders, in which Kissinger played a key role in editing and soliciting and doing the spade work for. He also wrote his dissertation during this time, which was about international peace during the Congress of Vienna and when it met after the Napoleonic Wars and tried to reconstruct a new order in Europe. All of that was there, and then Kissinger got his doctorate, but he didn't get a job right away. He got a minor teaching job at Harvard, but then he became recognized for writing an article about nuclear weapons in foreign affairs, and that would be one of the real keys to his subsequent rise, because he demonstrated such an intellectual range of thinking. And the article on nuclear weapons was picked up and seen by many influential decision makers and led to a series of appointments, one with the Council of Foreign Relations, and then as an advisor to the person who would become governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, and then later a presidential candidate.
Yeah, I think this part of his story really shows how intelligent and capable he is, because you just laid out so many different projects and books and articles, his dissertation, so many things he's involved in all at once. You can only imagine how much of a busy man he was, but he just invested himself so much into his studies, and this is what really set the stage for him to become a prominent diplomat, because he was getting recognized for his views on foreign policy and his politics. He was brought on as a advisor to the presidential candidate at the time, Nelson Rockefeller, who would never get the nomination. But the man who did get the Republican nomination is Richard Nixon, who we all know. So how did he eventually get in touch with Nixon after he was involved in politics?
Well, that's an interesting story itself, because he actually invited Nixon by letter to Harvard to speak to one of his seminars in the late 1950s when Nixon was vice president. Nixon, as vice president, was actually seen carrying Kissinger's book on nuclear weapons into a conference at the White House. So Nixon and Kissinger knew each other notionally. They had some sense of each other, but they had not met personally. They would not meet personally until 1967 at a cocktail party given by Clare Boothe Luce, who was a very influential figure in Republican politics in New York. But actually, Kissinger was a rival Kissinger did not like Nixon. Rockefeller was a real rival of Nixon's, and Rockefeller was on the liberal wing of the Republican Party at the time. And Kissinger did not think highly of Nixon, at least in private correspondence and other areas where he expressed it. He didn't come out publicly and talk about that. But it was not till 1968, and after Nelson Rockefeller's candidacy basically lost, when he lost at the Republican convention, that Nixon at least made overtures to the Nixon campaign. And finally, the Nixon people started taking some interest in him. But Kissinger was seen as one of the leading Republican intellectuals on foreign policy. So Nixon, even though Kissinger had not supported him, knew of him. And then after Nixon was elected, that was when, of course, they would have their first meeting at the Pierre Hotel in New York, in which Nixon would eventually, they would have a meeting of minds of sort. They would talk foreign policy. And at the end of it, Nixon did not directly offer him a job, but basically thought of him as someone he wanted to bring into the administration.
And that was the beginning of probably one of the most infamous and well-known friendships in all of American politics and American history. But I'd like to read off a quote that I saw when doing my research to kind of, if being Nixon's foreign policy advisor wasn't enough to set the stage, official biographer of Kissinger, Neil Ferguson, I think is how you pronounce his name, but he said, "One of the most important theorists about foreign policy ever to be produced in the United States," which is very high praise for Kissinger and really shows how, nationally recognized he was and really admired he was in that political space at the time. But one of his philosophies, Kissinger's philosophies when it comes to politics and foreign policy, was Realpolitik, which has taken on a life of its own over the past couple decades. But what exactly is Realpolitik?
Well, it's actually, the German pronunciation is Realpolitik, which is a German word that essentially is often translated as realistic policy. But realism is always in the eye of the beholder. Ultimately, Realpolitik means that a nation pursues policies that are designed to promote its national interest and power. It is not primarily interested in ideologies or morality or human rights or any sort of moral questions of the sort. It is interested in its power and its role in the international system and protecting its interests. It is a harsh policy. It basically is the notion that nations act in their interest and they don't, whether they adhere to commitments or whether they stay with alliances or whether they adopt war or peace, all has to do with how they're promoting their own power. It is a form of thinking about foreign policy that is not really native to American thinkers, who oftentimes either thought of foreign policy as something of a crusade, wanting to bring other countries to be more like the United States or within the American orbit, or wanted to isolate the United States from the rest of the world because of its contaminating influence. So it was very much a European role, the sort of cynical way in which diplomats would play with power, would change borders, would not really care much about the interests of their own people or what their common people thought, but the interests of their own states, their own power. In that sense, it harkens back to 19th century diplomacy of kings and princes and the rest, and the types of things that went on in Europe during the great competition for power during an earlier period in European history.
That's very interesting. I think that is definitely one of the contributing factors to a side of Kissinger's, of how he's viewed today, is that, he was a very controversial figure, war criminal, and I think a lot of that stems from that Machiavellian view of politics and world policy, Realpolitik, forget how to pronounce it, sorry, but it was very, very Machiavellian, very ruthless, very cynical, as you put it, which is a great way to describe it. But Nixon finally gets elected. Nixon's in office, and Kissinger is a foreign policy advisor for him. He's not yet Secretary of State. But one of the pressing matters at the time was the U.S.-Soviet relations, and Kissinger had a lot of influence and participation in that. But he had a policy of détente. So how did he use his policy of détente to relax the U.S.-Soviet relations, which at that time during the Cold War, there was a lot of animosity there?
There was. And Kissinger recognized early on, and this is also, I mean, there is a sort of mind meld here between Nixon and Kissinger, and you keep that in mind, that Nixon is also very interested. Nixon comes into office, and even though oftentimes in American history he's seen as somehow a warmonger because of his conduct of the Vietnam War, he himself thought of himself as a peacemaker. And he wanted some type of an arrangement with the Soviet Union. One of the things Nixon and Kissinger both learned when they came into office was that the Soviet Union had caught up with the United States in nuclear weapons and was in fact exceeding the United States in numbers of nuclear weapons. So there was a real balance now of power in a way that earlier, when Nixon was vice president back in the 50s, the United States had an overwhelming nuclear superiority. Now it was more or less equal. Now, the Soviet economy was not equal to the United States, but the Soviet military and power was, in that sense, equal. And so détente, in a sense, was the recognition that there could be some sort of balance of power between the United States and the Soviet Union. And it also was an effort then to relax tensions, to avoid getting to the brink of nuclear war, as what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and to do so by summit meetings, by repeated contact. One of the first things Nixon did was he established Kissinger as a back channel to the Soviet ambassador. That was his way of communicating privately to the Soviet Union, not through the State Department or the formal means, but to use Kissinger's direct relationship with the Soviet ambassador in Washington as a way to send messages to Moscow about the desire for an arms control agreement, for relaxing tension in other areas around the world, for trying to get a settlement in Vietnam. These were the sorts of things that he had Kissinger doing. And the goal was, again, détente, or some sort of relaxation of tensions that would ultimately begin and did happen with the famous Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement of 1972.
These definitely were, successful negotiations. I think it was kind of here where the Cold War and the U.S.-Soviet animosity kind of reached a climax. I mean, the Cold War definitely reached a climax during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but after this moment, it kind of seemed to wane until, the fall of the Soviet Union in 91. It never seemed to be as hot as it was back then. So I think Kissinger definitely played a huge hand in ending the Cold War, and it really shows Nixon's trust in Kissinger, that he didn't go through the State Department. He relied solely on Kissinger as that backdoor communication.
What you have to understand is that Nixon wanted to run foreign policy through the White House. He saw foreign policy particularly as a way also to gain domestic support. He knew that Americans wanted a peaceful relationship with the Soviet Union. He knew that, and he wanted to get credit for it. He wanted to do it, in a sense, through his own personal emissary. And that's one of the arguments in my book, is that it's very much, he built up Kissinger, and he wanted Kissinger to do these things, but it was a way also of trying to get credit for himself.
Yeah, Nixon was definitely a very egotistical man, so that seems very probable that he would want to do that kind of for his own legacy, and so he could get the credit.
And also win re-election. I remember anybody who's president always wants to win re-election, and that was what Nixon wanted to do.
Yeah, 100%. Any first-term president is going to do whatever they can to have as much public approval as possible. And I'm sure he also wanted more control. To be able to do foreign policy through the White House probably gave him more control. He wouldn't have to go through Congress and everything. But another major stepping stone in Kissinger's foreign policy story is the U.S.-China relations, which was a groundbreaking rapprochement and a groundbreaking summit which he negotiated for Nixon to go and visit in 72 after, I think it was like 25 years of no communication between China and the U.S. So how did he manage to successfully negotiate that summit?
Well, it's a great story. Kissinger was not someone initially who believed that relations with China could be opened. That was, in a lot of ways, I want to give more credit for Nixon, who I think recognized that there was a real opening because China's relationship with the Soviet Union had become so bad by 1969 that Chinese and Soviet troops were actually fighting border wars in the east and west of China's border with the Soviet Union. So Nixon recognized there was a real possibility here to break China out of its isolation and actually become or have a situation of what they would later call triangular diplomacy, was the United States' relationship with the Soviet Union and China was better than the relationship between China and the Soviet Union, even though both were communist countries. So Nixon and Kissinger then went about doing this. It was they used intermediaries. In particular, they used Pakistan, which had good relations with both the United States and China. And they would send messages in very old-fashioned diplomatic notes without the usual sort of repertoire of a printed mark from the U.S. government. These were unofficial markings. And they would send them through the Pakistanis to indicate an interest. And this went on for about a year before they finally got the type of reply that indicated that China would be willing to accept a representative of the United States to come and visit, and perhaps then to set up some meeting between Mao Zedong, the leader of China, and Richard Nixon and the president. And Kissinger jumped at the opportunity, and in July of 1971, he undertook a secret mission to China, leaving through Pakistan, and negotiated with Zhou Enlai, who was the Chinese foreign minister, to set up a meeting between Nixon and the Chinese leadership in 1972. And this was a stunning event. It completely surprised people in the United States. It also was very politically helpful for Nixon. It actually gave him a very big boost in the polls because Americans had thought of China as the real enemy of their country, more so than even the Soviet Union. And so the idea that Nixon was making peace with the Chinese was a huge thing. And I think it was a very important part of Kissinger's legacy. Nowadays, of course, China's role and rise as a power has made some people sort of question that. But I think that's terrible historical revisionism. It doesn't recognize that the situation and conditions in the 1970s were very different than they are today.
100%. That's one of my biggest philosophies as a historian is it's easy to look back in hindsight and see the result of something, but you have to, when looking back at events that happened in the past, you have to see it through the lens of the characters in that story and see how they saw it and put yourself in their shoes without knowing the outcome. So at that time, that was a remarkable achievement and a huge groundbreaking rapprochement with China and probably definitely one of Kissinger's high points in his career. But it's very funny. You mentioned earlier triangle diplomacy. It's kind of a love triangle between Russia, China, and the U.S. It's very fascinating the way they had to navigate around that and play cat and mouse and do third-party communicators. It just shows you the intricacies and delicacy of foreign policy, especially during the Cold War with the U.S. and communist animosities. But something is also interesting to note if you've ever seen Forrest Gump. Forrest Gump's take on it is ping pong diplomacy and how Forrest Gump's exceptional ping pong skills paved the way for Nixon's summit. So I'm interested to hear what your take is on that.
Well, it is actually an interesting. The Chinese used their invitation to the American ping pong team. There was a simultaneous aspect to this, because in April of 1971 is when the message finally came through that the Chinese were interested in a meeting. But at the same time, Zhou Enlai, in a different way, had invited or had one of the emissaries, one of the Chinese, invite the American ping pong team. So these things were going on roughly at the same time. And there's some fascinating, I talk about it in my book, fascinating telephone calls between Kissinger and Nixon during this time. because Kissinger and Nixon were recognizing that ping-pong diplomacy showed that there would be a real opportunity here for an American president to take advantage of this, that the obsession, Americans were so enamored of ping-pong diplomacy that it gave Nixon confidence that if he made this move with China, it would be greeted very strongly welcome by Americans. They wouldn't react angrily to it. They wouldn't say, "Oh my God, he's being nice to the Chinese. We fought them in Korea. They're terrible people." He'd actually recognize that people were really interested in the relationship with China. And so ping-pong diplomacy complemented what happened with Nixon and Kissinger secretly.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I mean, it adds a whole nother layer of complexity to the situation if it already wasn't complex enough with, all these different global powers involved. And he definitely did take advantage of it because it would prove successful. But the next stepping stone I would like to touch on with Kissinger's story is the whole Vietnam War situation. And I think it's really here where he earns that title from half of the aisle about being the war criminal and being the warmonger with his bombing of Cambodia and Laos and whatnot. So what was Kissinger's stance on the Vietnam War? And it's interesting because he's credited with negotiating the end of the Vietnam War, and he's actually appointed the Nobel Peace Prize. He's awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1973. And on the other hand, there's a vast amount of people who accuse him of being a war criminal. So it's a very interesting juxtaposition. So what was his stance on the Vietnam War, and how did he negotiate the end of it?
Kissinger actually was someone who actually believed that the war was a mistake. Not the initial intervention. He supported it publicly, but he came very soon privately. He was always very supportive of the government before he got into a position of authority. So he supported Lyndon Johnson's decisions, but he thought there had to be a negotiated settlement. But by the time he becomes National Security Advisor for Nixon, he basically thinks the war is a mistake, but that the United States, having invested and having lost already some 30,000 soldiers and having invested so much, needed to come out of the war with some sort of honorable end. Now, this is, of course, controversial because a lot of people feel that this needlessly prolonged the war. But Kissinger and Nixon both believed that the credibility of the United States would be damaged if the United States was seen as defeated in Vietnam and left and the communists took over right away. So he wanted to, in some ways, create a situation where the United States could negotiate an end, leave, and then what happened later would not be as seen as detrimental. And in that sense, I talk in my book about creating a decent interval, at least giving the South Vietnamese some period of time or a chance to survive, but not being committed permanently to the preservation of South Vietnam, but getting the North Vietnamese to agree to a peace settlement. This was very difficult. And some of the charges against Kissinger stem from the fact that Nixon and Kissinger pursued different methods to try and pressure the North Vietnamese. The North Vietnamese army had occupied a large section of eastern Cambodia. And having occupied that, they attacked American forces from Cambodia. So Nixon and Kissinger, having no longer being able to bomb North Vietnam because that had been so controversial under Johnson, and when he stopped it, it was impossible to restart it. Having lost that ability, they decided to bomb Cambodia and bomb and hit North Vietnamese installations there. But that, of course, also led to the North Vietnamese pulling deeper into the country and led to a great deal of instability in Cambodia. And it is the source of the argument that this was a war criminal because of what happened to Cambodia. But ultimately, this was all part of a strategy to try to end the war through a negotiated settlement. Ultimately, they did get a type of negotiated settlement. Kissinger stuck at it, but the agreement was very flawed. It had all of these so-called provisions for inspection, but no real consequences if anyone violated it. So ultimately, when the North Vietnamese invaded South Vietnam in 1975, there was nothing to stop them. There was no guarantees in the peace agreement. There were no military forces to prevent it or secure it. So it was more of a, you might say, I don't want to say fig leaf, but it basically was something to show the American people that we had the settlement. It also did, the one real achievement of it was that it led to the freeing of the American POWs in North Vietnam who had been there for years. People like John McCain and others who had been prisoner for almost 5 years by that time. So that was considered by many Americans a real achievement, to just get the POWs out. But ultimately, it did not secure the survival of South Vietnam, and it was essentially a way to let the United States get out without having South Vietnam collapse immediately. It took 2 more years for that to happen, and it required a North Vietnamese invasion for it to happen. In that sense, it was different from Afghanistan, where the Taliban took power almost immediately.
Yeah, it's such a complicated and controversial issue in American history because you lose all these American lives, and then in the end, you didn't really achieve anything because South Vietnam is still taken over by the communists you were trying to keep away. But like you mentioned, the peace talks, they dragged on, and that was a huge problem because more Americans were dying. But Kissinger ultimately did negotiate a settlement, even though it was an incomplete or incomprehensive one. But I think he kind of had to rush it because of the pressure from the U.S. population, the U.S. public, of the anti-war protests. So the government was very pressured to try to hurry this up. So it's just a very messy situation. But how was he ultimately awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for this? And I know he was jointly awarded, but his counterpart refused.
The politics of the Peace Prize are complicated themselves, but there was within the Peace Prize committee, the belief that what Kissinger and Le Duc Tho, the North Vietnamese negotiator, had done was worthy of this recognition. There were an awful lot of people when the Peace Prize was awarded who said there's no real peace in South Vietnam, because there wasn't. The war continued on a lower level for a while, and then when the North Vietnamese invaded in 1975 in a full-scale way. So there wasn't a full peace by any means. But in the same way as you might say that Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin were awarded the Peace Prize for peace, it was seen as almost a partial success. Or Menachem Begin and Yasser Arafat, or I'm sorry, not Menachem Begin, but Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat were awarded the peace for Oslo, which ultimately wasn't a success either. So yes, the Peace Prize sometimes makes its judgments before peace really is established, and that was once also the case in 1973. I should add, Kissinger took the prize money from the Peace Prize and endowed a scholarship fund for American soldiers' children who were killed in Vietnam. So he did not benefit from the prize financially in any manner.
Yeah, that's very noble of him, especially contributing to a cause like that. Giving money to the families of the men killed in the Vietnam War, being awarded a Nobel Prize for his peace talks in the Vietnam War. I know he necessarily didn't feel like he deserved it, so that's very noble of him to do that. But what I'd like to get into next, and this is kind of the last of the 4 big aspects of his career, and that was his involvement in the Middle East and the Yom Kippur War and Egypt and Israel, which he probably had a unique perspective on as a Jew, which I'd like to get into a little later. But what exactly was the Yom Kippur War, and how was Kissinger involved with the negotiations with Egypt and Israel?
The Yom Kippur broke out on October 6th, 1973. It's actually thought that Hamas was in their attack on October 7th. We're actually also doing that's the 50-year since the Yom Kippur War. It was a joint attack by Egypt and Syria. Egypt across the Suez Canal, Syria and the Golan Heights, to try and reclaim territory that they had lost in the 1967 Six-Day War to Israel. They caught the Israelis by surprise. It was no one thought that the Egypt and Syria would attack because it was thought that Israel had such overwhelming military superiority that an attack would be disastrous. And in catching Israel by surprise, Egypt particularly was able to cross the canal and inflict quite serious damage on Israeli forces in the Suez region, as well as Syria and the Golan Heights. Israel was on its heels the first few days of the war, but eventually recovered and was able actually to launch offensives against both and threaten both capital Cairo and Damascus. Kissinger was involved because Egypt and Syria were Soviet allies, and the United States was seen as an ally of Israel. This was seen, given that Kissinger had been so involved in détente and easing relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now you had a situation in which allies of each country had gone to war. And this would be the classic situation in which the United States and the Soviet Union should be able to get together to try to end that war. But it was not as easy. It was not that easy, since both felt that they needed to be loyal to their allies, and their allies wanted them to support the war. And both the United States and the Soviet Union sent major resupplies. We sent an enormous amount of supplies to help Israel recoup its losses and to be able to turn the tide of the war. And the Soviets did as well with Egypt and Syria.
There's another quote I would like to bring up, which just really rattled my mind when I came upon it in my research, especially with Kissinger being a Jew and Israel being our allies in this conflict. He said, "If it weren't for the accent of my birth, I would be anti-Semitic, and any people who has been persecuted for 2,000 years must be doing something wrong." And that really kind of blew my mind here, because Israel's our ally. He's a Jew. So what do you make of that and how it applies to the situation?
Kissinger had a sense of humor, and there is an element of a sort of dark humor there. The idea that if I hadn't been born a Jew, I'd be an anti-Semite. You have to understand the context of that particular comment. After the ceasefire, Kissinger arranged ultimately a ceasefire between Israel and Egypt in the Yom Kippur War, also with Soviet backing. After that, Kissinger then began a whole process, which would later be called shuttle diplomacy, of trying to get agreements between Egypt and Israel and Syria. These were very difficult agreements to hammer out. And in some ways, Israel was much tougher to deal with than Egypt or Syria. Now, one of the reasons for that was that Egypt and Syria were basically dictatorships. Anwar Sadat, even though he's favorably viewed by most Americans, was still basically the leader of Egypt. He didn't have to deal with a whole bunch of parliamentary figures and everything else when he decided that he wanted a particular agreement. And Hafez Assad in Syria also was a dictator. So Kissinger often found negotiating with them was easier than going back to Israel, where he'd have to deal with the prime minister, the cabinet, the Knesset, and sometimes they made his life crazy. And he made that comment that Israel's making him into an anti-Semite, this sort of thing, and he got angry at various points with the Israelis. And there was a point in 1975 where Kissinger was trying to negotiate another disengagement agreement where the talks failed, and he had to come home without a success. And he made, or at least encouraged, President Ford at the time to call for a complete rethinking of our aid to Israel. This was scandalous at the time, that the idea that we were going to rethink our aid, but it was part of Kissinger's attempt to put pressure on Israel to change its mind. And Kissinger, even though he was Jewish, and in some ways I think saw Israel's interest as similar to that of the Americans, was very unpopular in Israel because he wanted Israel to make concessions. He wanted Israel basically to give territory back to Egypt and to Syria as a part of getting peace. And in the long run, especially with Egypt, this proved to be brilliant and actually worked effectively. But many Israelis at the time did not see it that way, and he was controversial. And now he's seen much differently, that he did have that he did at least recognize that one of the most important things Israel could do was make peace with Egypt. And in some ways, he laid the basis for what Jimmy Carter then would do a few years later in the Camp David Accords, of getting a final agreement between Sadat and Begin, and laying the basis for peace between Egypt and Israel.
So that quote kind of came from a place of frustration. So that adds context, because you laid it out beautifully. As you can imagine, dealing with a prime minister and a cabinet and all these diplomats is probably a lot more complicated than just dealing with one person as a dictator, even though they might be on the wrong side. But this ultimately was another monumental achievement that he can put under his belt, laying the foundations for the Camp David peace accords that would ultimately be signed and negotiated by Carter. So Vietnam, Russia, China, the Middle East, there's just so many monumental and very difficult, complicated scenarios that he was able to negotiate, which is just a testament to his career as a foreign policy advisor and as Secretary of State. But another thing I would like to touch on, backtracking a little bit, is the Watergate scandal, because he was very close to Nixon, and everybody close to Nixon got just destroyed by the Watergate scandal. They all got the boot. And he was able to keep his distance and actually stay in as Secretary of State under Ford. So what happened to Kissinger after the Watergate scandal broke out?
Well, it's actually interesting, because in some ways Kissinger's anger about leaks in the White House and the fact that things had been leaked to the press, the Pentagon Papers were leaked by Daniel Ellsberg. His concern with leaks, which actually led to some of the abuses of Watergate, namely the plumbers unit that broke into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist office and that would later break into the Watergate Hotel. Kissinger had actually been one of the people complaining about leaks and this sort of thing, but he was almost from the beginning, because of his role in foreign policy, Nixon actually gave him sort of a pass and sort of told people, well, he's not involved in any of this sort of stuff. And the media and Americans were largely willing to see it that way. Now, Kissinger wasn't involved directly in the sort of politics of the Nixon campaign that broke into Watergate, but he knew about the plumbers, some of what went on in the earlier period. But Nixon sort of, in a way, wanted Kissinger to be able to continue to conduct foreign policy while he was fighting for his position at home. Nixon was, and in a sense, he insulated Kissinger from this. And I argue in my book that the media and many people in the American government wanted Kissinger to stay because they felt he was so vital to foreign policy. They didn't want to weaken him during the Watergate scandal. Their anger was more directed at Nixon. And the ironic thing is Nixon felt that his foreign policy would be the reason why they would never impeach him, because it was such a good policy. But in fact, as the evidence mounted and then the tapes and all the rest, they were willing to impeach him because they thought basically his foreign policy was being run by Kissinger, and so they could lose Nixon and you would still have a good foreign policy. And Gerald Ford, when he came into office, the first thing he did was say Henry Kissinger is going to run foreign policy. So in a way, Kissinger became Nixon had built him up, but Kissinger in the end did not throw him a life preserver. Nixon sank, and Kissinger actually survived Watergate.
100%. He was definitely so vital and so entrenched in negotiations that removing him from that would probably have global ramifications, because he was so vital to the negotiations and so involved in all these different issues that, some little scandal over in America with Nixon would destroy a lot of foreign affairs and relations. But I know one of the last works and pieces of writing that he did was a book on artificial intelligence, which is such a huge issue and subject of debate today. So I'm very interested to hear what his thoughts are on the state of artificial intelligence and how it could impact foreign policy and the future of the world.
Well, Here I'm going to be careful because my own understanding of artificial intelligence is pretty limited. I can say that his concern was that the development of artificial intelligence could lead, particularly in the military sphere, to situations that really were impossible for states, men or women, to control. That you could get into a situation with artificial intelligence that would lead to a cascading sense of events happening. In particular, Kissinger deeply worried about the United States and China relationship and it going off the rails over Taiwan or the South China Sea Islands. He was very concerned that the fact that both countries were making great advances in artificial intelligence might lead to a situation where weaponry and security decisions were made in ways that did not allow for sufficient control by human beings. And in that sense, he worried a great deal that artificial intelligence could change the whole nature of interaction in the diplomatic field. Now, I can't get, my own understanding is too limited to get to how that would happen, but that was among his concerns, and he actually did then co-write with one of the people from Google and others this work on artificial intelligence. And he was very concerned that technology in that sense could create a situation where diplomacy would be, which he always valued. He always valued diplomacy. Till the end of his days, he valued the importance of negotiation and diplomacy and talking to your enemies, and worried greatly when relations with China, especially when we weren't talking to China, that this was a crucial thing. He was worried about the impact of artificial intelligence on the conduct of diplomacy.
That's so fascinating, but also concerning. I think I can definitely see a future where we get ahead of ourselves with AI, kind of like how we got ahead of ourselves with nuclear weapons. When Oppenheimer created the nuclear bomb, it was like nothing ever achieved by humanity. I mean, he completely changed the world. A lot of people like to say we're just living in Oppenheimer's world now with nuclear weapons. But there's kind of that same threat with AI, although there are benefits to AI, but there could be a situation where we get ahead of ourselves with AI, and there could end up being another, I don't know how to even describe it, a Cold War with AI with China and the US. It's a very complicated and concerning issue. I hope that, policymakers and decision makers and AI developers are very careful and really thinking this stuff through. But public perception over time obviously has been sort of split with Kissinger as an American hero or a warmonger, and I'm interested to hear your professional opinion on it. Do you think he's an American hero, a warmonger, or something in between?
You're giving me a very polar, very wide spectrum to choose, and I in my book, and I do want to encourage your listeners. It's still on sale. It's on Amazon, that sort of thing. In my book, I try to reach a balanced assessment of Henry Kissinger, recognizing his achievements and his failures. I think on the whole, I would probably come down more positively on his attempt to guide the United States in a particularly troubled time. I think he made a number of key mistakes along the way, but he also had some important achievements. We haven't talked as much about his mistakes, but he did make them. I think he did underestimate the power of issues like human rights and the degree to which concern about human rights would become an important factor in American diplomacy. These are things that I think are there, but at the same time, I think he did offer a sustained intellectual contribution to American foreign policy over a period of more than 60, 70 years. I mean, Kissinger became prominent in the 1950s, and he was still talking about foreign policy in 2023. That's an extraordinarily lengthy period of time to be a figure of influence in American foreign policy. I think a lot of the condemnation of Kissinger is quite selective. It's often out of context. It's also very morally blind to alternatives. It wants a very simple answer to complicated moral questions. And it's emotionally satisfying for many people because of I think, the feeling of wanting to find an enemy for problems that have happened, but I don't think it adds much to our understanding. So I do come down probably more in the positive sense of Kissinger's achievements and contribution than I do in terms of the negative. But I think Kissinger, one of the things I say at the end of my book is he both came to represent American power and exercise it, and that was a unique figure in American history, I think, in that manner.
Yeah, I think I would have to agree with you. After doing my own research and talking with you over the last hour, I think his achievements were so monumental that I think the good outweighs the bad with Kissinger. And these were such complicated issues to navigate that navigating them and coming to these agreements and negotiations were just monumental achievements in American political history and American history in general. But Thomas, I want to thank you so much for coming on. I will have your book, Henry Kissinger and American Power, in the description, linked to Amazon, so you guys can go buy it and check it out. Like you said, it is still on sale. So Thomas, thank you for coming on.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the program. I really enjoy it. I could talk about Henry Kissinger a lot, and you've given me an hour to do it, and I appreciate that.